I'm Craig Torres. This is the Global Rewire podcast, and I'm here with my co-host, Fabio Natalucci. Fabio, recently we interviewed Matteo Maggiore about geoeconomics, or how states build and keep and bully the rest of the world with hegemonic power, financial networks, that sort of thing. Today's guest seems like a natural follow. He's Logan Wright, partner at Rhodium Group, the world's largest China macroeconomic forecaster and advisory group. Today, we're going to talk about the Chinese economy and China. And a quick reminder that the Anderson Institute is independent, not funded by political parties, interest groups, or anything like that. So take it away, Fabio.
Now, first of all, I'm really happy to have Logan here. Logan and I started talking when I was at U.S. Treasury as Deputy Assistant Secretary, and I went to China for the first time. And I will be talking since to my IMF time, after IMF time, and I really believe he's probably the best China expert I know of. So it's great to have him on the podcast today.
Thank you, Fabio. Happy to be here. It's like I really enjoyed our conversations over the years. Happy to continue, of course.
So we can start maybe from that point that Greg raised. So we had Matteo Maggiore, we talk about geoeconomics. So I'd be curious to see what's your view on the current state of engagement between US and China if you look into the lens of geoeconomics and geopolitics.
Sure. I mean, I think there's a couple of structural conditions in the U.S.-China economic relationship that have changed and really do influence the way in which trade negotiations are ongoing. One is that the Chinese economy is in a much weaker state in terms of imbalances between production and demand, and the state of their capacity to generate domestic demand in particular. And that influences sort of the scope for potential negotiations over relinking the two economies. Simply put, this isn't the same environment as when the Phase 1 trade deal was being discussed. There are fewer U.S. and global businesses that are deeply engaged and interested in market access in China. There are smaller multiples or potential growth of profitability in the Chinese economy itself. So with that in mind, it makes it more difficult for Beijing to credibly offer something to the administration that's likely to be sustainable and to keep the relationship on track in the course of negotiations. I mean, they can offer very limited purchases of agricultural products, of commercial aircraft, but nothing that's really likely to resolve the bilateral trade imbalance. And then there's a question of, China's larger global trade imbalances. And then there's a question of inbound investment and the kind of politics around inbound Chinese investment in the United States. So simply put, from 2025 to 2020, there's a very different kind of climate around the Chinese economy. And so that influences the scope for potential negotiations and the scope for China's integration into the global economy as well. What's happened has been that we're on the flip side of a historic credit bubble. Because of that, China cannot replicate the same sources of investment growth as in the past. That slowdown in investment growth has materialized primarily through weakness in property investment and local government infrastructure investment. The question now is, how long can China sort of smooth out the slowdown in investment, or is it going to generate a sharper decline? Because while consumption is growing in China, it's not at the same pace that can maintain the same rates of economic growth as in the past. And so with that imbalance in mind, the longer that China is continuing to favor a advanced manufacturing investment-led growth strategy without really having the policy levers to generate domestic demand, it more or less guarantees that there will be trade tensions in China's future. It more or less guarantees that external imbalances will expand without coordinated pushback against Chinese exports. And that's kind of the political debate that we're in. The question is, where does that pushback come from? Does China itself change its own growth model, which is what the world has been asking for to sort of encourage additional domestic consumption? Are there labor market tensions within China because the industries that China is favoring for the future, artificial intelligence, advanced robotics, green technologies, these are capital intensive industries. They don't employ very many people. It's not obvious without a reform of the fiscal system that you're going to have follow-on gains for the Chinese household in this process. So the Chinese labor market could be a constraint, or external pressures could be a constraint. And China's attempt is to stop a multilateral coalition against Chinese exports from forming, but it could happen even without U.S. coordination, because there's going to be stronger incentives for many of China's trading partners to push back against a rising tide of exports.
There's a lot to unpack here. So let me go back to the beginning in terms of the negotiation between the two, right? So there's a fine line between independence and leverage that you have, right? So when you're more independent, you have some leverage that you can exert on in the negotiation. When you're much less interdependence, like perhaps we are now, at some point, as you mentioned, you may run out of leverage. Do you think we are at some sort of like turning point in the relationship now between China and US, and how this is going to play out going forward?
I think China's efforts in the negotiations are basically to focus on supply-related controls rather than restrictions on demand. So in other words, China doesn't have that much to offer the U.S. in a negotiation. What they can offer is to be protected from retaliation over supply controls, over rare earths, over other critical inputs. Rare earths are an extreme example of the kind of leverage that China has, but certainly not the only one. I mean, there can be several other intermediate goods or intermediate inputs that would impact global supply chains, that would impact different industries specifically. So the negotiations have a kind of ironically friendly tone where both sides seem like they are making concessions and agreeing on the types of the parts of the economic relationship that they want to shield from retaliation and competition, and narrowing that kind of behavior. But in reality, what's underlying this is the fact that the interdependence of the relationship is increasingly weaponized. And so I think it's a turning point because of that weaponization of supply chains that has been meaningful. But essentially, it's more in the U.S. interests to focus on restrictions on demand, whether that is through tariffs or whether that is through technical controls or non-tariff barriers on U.S. entry, the way that you've seen restrictions on Chinese electric vehicles in the U.S. market, for example. Well, it's in the Chinese interest to focus on supply and restrictions therein. And then it's not a race between those two. This is a constant negotiation that will play out, where both sides will see at various points their interests impacted by the tools that the other side is using and how credible those tools become. Right now, the restrictions on demand from the United States don't appear as credible a threat to China because China can diversify their exports. That's not sustainable over the long term, and it's not likely to be something that China can do indefinitely. But that's sort of what's happened right now. Similarly, restrictions on supply for China aren't really credible over the long term either. They can sort of be used temporarily to impose pain and force negotiations, but you can't keep threatening to cut off the world's industry from critical inputs without impacting your own growth over time. So there's a diminishing quality to all of these threats that comes from the nature of interdependence overall.
Great leaders can read the world and decide how to position. I might point out that Vladimir Putin seems to be a really good reader of his international partners, except that he responds with violence and disturbance. So how is China reading the sort of threats against Europe from Russia, the disarray of U.S. politics, And how do they respond to that?
First of all, it's very hard to know, but I think we can read a lot of what they're saying and the official statements and some of the party theoretical discussions of this and some of their internal dialogue. So it's not completely unknowable, but it's hard to know exactly how they're reacting to individual trends as you're discussing. The way I would characterize it is there is an ideological view that has been propagated throughout the Chinese system basically since 2017, 2018, with Trump's first election, that broadly speaking, there are great changes unseen in a century, quote unquote, in terms of international order, and that the East is rising and the West is in decline, and that's been phrased in various formulations. That's sort of an ideological commitment, but it's very difficult for the Chinese leadership to break away from. So if you
it's
talk
also self-aggrandizing in
of course,
certain
of course, and it's important to understand that narrative, that the propaganda message that China's rise is inevitable, is probably their most important propaganda message that China tries to carry, because it's necessary to both push back against the U.S. economic statecraft, to break down sort of U.S. alliance networks, as well as to make it easier to negotiate China's own bilateral claims. You would think about China entirely differently if they expressed a more contingent view around their own economic growth outlook, around their own growth and power. And that's so sort of important to keep in mind. So on the one hand, there's this ideological foundation around this, and then the question becomes, how much do China's leaders actually believe that? And what do they see as their tools to grow, to promote the expansion of their own influence? And so, I think right now, the level of confidence in Beijing is extremely high based on the way in which they've managed threats from the United States over the course of the year. That's sort of our read so far, but that will probably pass because China can't be provoking trade conflict with all of their trade partners at once, and will inevitably sort of be back into modes where they have to moderate these relationships and make concessions. Essentially, China's goal is to sort of play countries off against one another, bilateralize trade disputes, prevent multilateral coalitions that are restricting trade and economic development, and to sort of think about their interests that way. With Russia, for example, you have developments, the Power Siberia 2 pipeline, developments that have basically brought Russia far closer to China's economic orbit, that have made Russia far more dependent upon China. And at the same time, they don't have that much agency over Russian conduct of the war, even though they could exhibit significant leverage in shutting it down or trying to slow down military assistance as well. So it's a very mixed set of conditions in terms of how they evaluate this. But I think that on balance, they're saying that developments are moving more in the direction of great changes are still unseen in a century. The East is still rising, the West is declining. It's not true in an economic sense for China anymore. And so the question becomes, how quickly does that perception break in the rest of the world? But I think they would say that regardless of what GDP is saying, we're still making advancements in advanced technology. We're still leading the world in green energy, and we're expanding our relations with the developing world, which are the growth engines of the future. And so I think that's how Beijing would internally formulate their viewpoint.
Some of the action of the U.S. administration are actually pushing some of the rest of the world in that direction, right? So India is an example. By having those bilateral relationships where you punish some allies, you pursue some objective on a one-on-one basis, what we have seen, think of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting, right? You see some of those countries gravitating toward China. So some of those parties seems to be playing to that playbook.
Yeah, I mean, if there's U.S. efforts to sort of create tariffs against allies and adversaries alike to, to weaken the credibility of alliances, sort of plays into Beijing's efforts to break up these relationships into bilateral arrangements, and then to reinforce multilateral, and global trade arrangements that are more favorable to them. Hence, the most recent concession toward the WTO and saying that they're going to now, basically admit that they're a developing country for WTO treatment purposes, or for WTO purposes, after a move that was essentially 15 years too late.
So one question in terms of, like, if you think about, again, the relationship in terms of through the lenses of the geopolitics, like, in some sense, the US seems to be turning more like China-like, right? If you think of like tariffs, export controls, restriction on inbound and outbound investment, direct intervention in the economy, like taking stakes in Intel, Golden Share, into rare earths now. While China seems to be playing more the old US globalization playbook. So what's your views in difference in terms of what we can call maybe like state capitalism in the US versus capitalism with social Chinese characteristic in China? What's the difference in your view?
Several differences, of course, but I mean, you're absolutely right to point out those kinds of parallels that you're seeing between the two systems. I think many of them are very superficial and won't really last. In part because many of these interventions in China, have not worked, have been, extraordinarily, have contributed to some of the excesses in production, the imbalances, the domestic economy. But on the one hand, if you view the problem in the global economy as fundamentally linked to the imbalances in China's growth model that have to do with the overextension of the financial system that has enabled production far in excess of domestic demand, the continued deflationary pressure that comes from credit that's funded into the non-financial corporate sector, and the inability to generate corresponding levels of household consumption. If that overcapacity is really at the core of global trade tensions, there's no other way to respond to a model that is forcing disinvestment in the rest of the world than by encouraging investment, than by trying to push back and generate new forms of investment and protecting those with trade barriers. So on the one hand, I am unsympathetic to the forms of intervention in U.S. companies that the Trump administration has taken so far, and I don't think these will really be efficient forms of government injections of capital. On the other hand, industrial policy needs to leverage private capital for the purpose of reindustrialization, in part to accelerate some of the rebalancing of the economy away from China-centric supply chains. So those two pressures, I think both of those things can be true, and that is not borrowing from China's playbook. It's essentially responding to China's playbook in that sense. In China's sense, you're exactly right that they'll be now, they'll be speaking to the rest of the world saying, we want a rules-based order in which continually deflating prices of Chinese exports can become more and more attractive in developing markets. In many developing markets, they'll happily take subsidized, essentially subsidized clean energy, subsidized goods at lower prices. But in many, they will push back where there are domestic industries that will resist that. You've seen the response in Mexico to rising steel imports, where you've had this sort of starting buildup of a Chinese trade war and retaliation against Chinese pecan imports from Mexico. The same as in Brazil as well, where you've had, Brazil has a trade surplus with China, so you're not likely to see any really aggressive trade restrictions, but there are still tariffs on steel. And so there are limits to how much China can expand this, but I see the parallelism. I see the media narrative that you're citing. But I think there are real limits to how far either of those trends can extend, like China's embrace of a more open, liberal international system, as well as U.S. turns into state intervention into companies.
Okay, can I push back for a second on this
Sure.
too? With two different line of argument. I think one, it's on what I think it's unclear here in the US, in my view, is I understand the issue of national security, manufacturing back into the US, onshoring. But there seems to be a lack of clarity at this point, which sector are national security strategic, which are not. And on top of that, a lack of governance, if you want, like process, right? You enter in some sector, under what condition, what is the entry point? So that's one point. The second point is, especially coming from Europe, my experience, at least growing up there, is once you start entering into once you accept the idea the government can start managing actively the economy, that becomes very quickly a very bipartisan approach. That no matter who's in power, they seem to like to meddle with the economy. And so coming back in reverse, it's very, very hard, and it takes a lot of time. I don't know, views on that?
I wouldn't quibble with your characterization and your own lived experience there. I mean, I think it's once you think you have these sort of levers over the economy, it probably is harder to back away. The question is, what's if we continue on our current trends and we continue to see, if China's growth model essentially depends upon forcing disinvestment in the rest of the world. If they cannot generate domestic demand, the only way in which they can grow in relative terms is by increasing global export market share. On those trends, it is not a politically sustainable dynamic in and of itself. It's very likely to generate anti-trade policies and political motivations in parties of both on the left and the right in democratic systems. And we've seen that. We've seen that, obviously in the United States, and we've seen it, I think we'll start to see more of it in Europe as well. So I'm very sympathetic to the idea that none of this is ideal, and none of this is in line with what we would think about as more efficient market outcomes. But essentially, if you think that the inefficiency and the way Brad Setzer describes this, I always think is very apt, because you essentially said that free market economies have decided to place most of their industrial production and investment in a market that has not freed itself. And when you have these kinds of broader sort of structural imbalances in the global economy, there has to be some sort of response, even if it is relatively inefficient. I completely agree that I don't think that there's an overarching vision on how to achieve this or what industries are more strategic. Instead, and nor has there been with the Trump administration an attempt to create the political space for allies to participate in a broader restructuring of global supply chains. There's instead been a narrower focus on investment in the United States itself and a kind of zero-sum attitude to negotiations about those investments, rather than a attempt to sort of say this is going to be a new global supply chain, and that will be necessary to sort of break off some of China's tools of leverage.
I think there's a lack of understanding. Oh, sorry, Craig, then I'll be quiet. On the intertemporal trade-off too, right? So there's a reason to do this onshoring specific sector into the US, but it's never in this discussion what it means over the medium term in terms of competition, for example, like from a market perspective, in terms of incentive to innovate and invest in innovation as opposed to investing time in lobbying, spending time in Washington. That intertemporal cost benefit, it's at least to my understanding or to what I hear and see, it's very much missing at this point. It's down the line, it's for someone else to essentially care later on.
And I think there hasn't been this real attempt to sort of put the investment challenge in the context of a strategic reorientation of the global economy that is necessary. And And in part because I don't think the viewpoint that I've advanced is necessarily consensus by any means, that this is the only remedy that's possible. So, and I do understand that in discussing this, but I think that's correct. No one's really said this is where these industries are likely to be in the next 3 to 5 years unless these changes are made. And I think what's less understood is that signals of these kinds of changes in policy and signals of additional investment coming down the line will also change Beijing's behavior and will change their own incentives to continue this model of development. It has been successful without much pushback so far in gaining global export market share, but that is invariably trending toward more deflationary pressure in the rest of the world, less investment in the rest of the world, a weaker global economy overall, and it's not really being framed in that way. It's being framed very narrowly in terms of cost efficiency in the short term.
It seems like we've been talking about China's need to boost domestic demand for 20 years. And it also seems to me that I'm not accusing you of this, but we never talk about the elephant in the room. That is, if you want consumers to consume more, invest more in their own economy, don't you need more democracy, more rule of law, more certainty, and basically your own Chinese version of John Locke that asserts that property rights are solid and somewhat sacred and can never be taken from you. And when your economy is just, secreting out capital and savings, it says something. It really does. So what's the solution to that? And do you ever see China waking up and realizing this, the ruling party, that is, we're the problem. We're actually the problem.
Well, I mean, I think Chinese officials have made that argument over the last 2 decades, in particular, over the last 20 years in which the economy has remained in balance. I think you're absolutely right to flag this, which is that in 2004, at the Central Economic Work Conference in December 2004, basically China set rebalancing their economy along multiple metrics, but consumption versus investment, consumption versus exports, rural versus urban development, as pretty much its primary policy goal. And not only has that, the real question that you want to ask is, if you think that China's leadership is essentially competent, is essentially technocratic, and can generally achieve their long-term objectives, how do you reconcile that fact with the fact that the economy has become that much more imbalanced over time? And I think it's easy to explain because as investment-led growth became attractive and continued to power the economy, it creates its own sort of path-dependent logic, and it created this extension of the financial system, which was really supercharged not in 2004 to 2008, but after the global financial crisis, when the credit expansion was, China saw basically a third of global GDP in new credit in just one country in 8 years. It's nothing that the world has ever seen before. And what we're now paying for is all of that bad debt essentially coming due. And so if you're thinking about, what are the constraints on household consumption? What is the limitation on household consumption? Basically, there are 4. If you go through the literature and if you follow the sort of logic. One is the sort of Michael Pettis argument that it's the household income share of GDP that's too low. Household income to GDP and the flow of funds data is 61%. It stayed around that level. That's not terribly low in international comparisons, but then the fiscal system doesn't really add to that or doesn't really offset some of those pressures. So that's one argument. Second is, Thomas Piketty wealth inequality, that it doesn't matter if the household income share is higher if it's unequally distributed, and it is highly unequally distributed in China, that it's not really going to boost consumption anyway, even if you boost household incomes. Third is the level of household debt, which really rose substantially during the property bubble. Because household income is low as a share of GDP, the household debt to income ratio is close to international peaks. It's in the 150% range, 140 to 150% range, but it's also coming down because the property bubble is already deflated. And then there's precautionary savings. Now, precautionary savings has long been attributed the weakness of the social safety net so that household savings is high. In our estimation, savings in China are basically concentrated in three pockets. High net worth individuals, which is true everywhere, state-owned corporates and monopolies and oligopolies, and private sector enterprises that are essentially cut off from the financial system. And so if those are the pockets, it's not an improvement in the healthcare system helps migrant workers spend more. Change in pension equalization across rural and urban residents helps to catalyze additional spending. But the real breakthroughs are going to be made through tax policy and restructuring the fiscal system. That's what you have to do. You have to change how those institutions are taxed and where your sources of tax revenue come from. So the problem for the government right now is that if they changed the model toward consumption-led growth, it would bankrupt the government. All the sources of tax revenue depend upon essentially investment-led growth, value-added tax, corporate income tax. There's very little charged in domestic consumption tax and individual income taxes. Domestic consumption taxes are largely just on, very limited selections of goods. So this is a byproduct of, what the question you're essentially asking is, why have they chosen to allow the decay of the system rather than fixing it more sustainably? Why have they chosen to continue on this path? Is it ideological and based on the structure of the political system? I would argue it is not. It is based on, pure logic of survival. And the question that we should be asking is, why can't Xi Jinping go on television tomorrow and say, we're going to adjust the entire growth model. It means slower growth in the short term, but you'll all be better off because we're going to make this a far more consumer-centric economy in the future, and we're going to change the fiscal system accordingly. I think the answer of that comes to strategic competition. It comes to the idea that you won't be able to sustain some of your political goals if you think that the model is flawed. It might be
Wait, what's the political goal?
No, this is the whole China. What is China's great rejuvenation? This is competition against the United States. I think this is the key question. If you say we're going to have slower GDP growth for 3 or 4 years, and I wrote this recently in a piece on our Rhodium's website on the strategic logic of China's economic data. Why can't you revise past growth rates down? You need to basically maintain longer-term supply contracts with, for raw materials. You need to push back against U.S. sanctions and export controls if and when they arise and stop competition therein. And if you want to stop de-risking or decoupling, you need to have a domestic market that's worth focusing on, that's worth preserving access to. So this is part of the broader where I started, which is that one of China's primary propaganda messages is our rise is inevitable. This would run contrary to that. And the point is there are no easy solutions. Decay and things deteriorating over time is a simpler and more attractive political choice than reform, because reform creates the possibility for crisis. And it's only when you say that these the question in China is how to write down the capital stock, how to choose who loses in the process, not who's going to win.
In your list of factors, you didn't mention one, which is at the time when the housing bubble, whether we have reached the trough or not, we can debate that, but it destroyed a lot of wealth, right? There was a storage of wealth for the Chinese household, like housing. That's occurring at a time when you have the demographics that it's completely against you, right? The Chinese economy society is getting older and older. That's another factor where it's very hard to jumpstart consumption at that time. That combo of the two makes the jumpstarting consumption. You want to save more. You lost wealth, you're getting older. You're not going to go out and consume more. You want to save more, actually.
Exactly. And that is changing. It's very clear that since the property bubble collapsed, and since zero COVID policies, soft measures of consumer confidence, indexes of activity have plunged and have not recovered. Wage growth has not recovered. there is this imbalance, as I discussed, in the growth model that China is favoring, which is focused on capital-intensive industries. In 2000, only about 5 to 10% of new entrants to the labor force were college educated. Now it's closer to 50, 60% every year. So the structure of the economy is not adjusted, while the labor force and the benefit and their needs have completely adjusted. The significance of the property sector adjustment is exactly what you said, Fabio, which is that you've got probably some negative real wealth effect. We don't know how far prices really are, but it probably generates a lot more caution in future investments at the same time, and a lot more savings overall. We have seen some byproducts of that in these consumer confidence surveys. But the other significance is that it's not obvious where else you put money into China, in China, that will generate the same potential for wealth. And so it is the decline in confidence is not just that you've lost the property sector as a potential driver, but it's not obvious where else you go. And a lot of government attempts to shore up the equity market, I think, are kind of focused on where else can household savings flow if it's not the property sector.
It sounds to me like this may be leading to a political crisis. It doesn't sound sustainable unless you have massive amounts of propaganda that keeps saying we're in a race to against the world and you're just all going to have to suffer for it and consume less, and we're creating enemies left and right. It sounds like this needs to break somehow. How will it?
Well, Craig, I mean, what I would answer is nothing in China ever looks sustainable in the long term, and nothing looks that threatening in the short term, right? I mean, this is the dynamic that's always been true. If you look over the long term, this can't continue. If you look in the short term, they have more capacity and capabilities to counter short-term threats and crisis than virtually any other emerging economy or any other political system. So how does a long-term threat become a short-term crisis? And the answer is when the government decides. This is exactly the core of the question that I was framing. The decision is on who loses. The decision is on what you break, because once you actually decide that there's a loss to be held among some industry that was previously considered to be supported. And so when do you see these crises in China? 2021, you had the government suddenly changing their support for the major internet platform companies and tech behemoths, and suddenly they were, being attacked, kind of as part of a political campaign. They pulled support for education and tutoring companies at the same time. Risks that were not previously considered and suddenly emerged because of changes in government policy. So the answer is that, and this is exactly the core of the conundrum I was pointing out. Decay is an easier choice. Choosing to reform and initiate these changes provokes the only possibility of crisis. And so we should be preparing for more decay, because those choices become more and more difficult the further out you push them. And that's kind of it. I think what is breaking is the external conditions that will facilitate China's growth model. Because if they depend that much more upon, I mean, I think ultimately the pushback is not internal in China based on the labor market or labor conditions, although that's certainly possible. The pushback is likely to be, based on the difficulty in China continuing to export to the rest of the world, or to fight over what's becoming a shrinking pie of global demand, because there will be, if they continue in this process, it's likely to generate more and more pushback elsewhere.
Logan, if you take the story of the inevitable rise of the East, right, and you look at through the lenses of portfolio flows and FDI, so since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, so the last 3 years, we have seen a huge rebound in portfolio flows into emerging markets. We've seen FDI to emerging market. That has not happened for China, neither portfolio flows nor FDI. So at least judging, but quantitatively, for things that you can assess with numbers, it doesn't look like that this narrative is actually being translated into like investment strategies.
Economic data isn't going to stop propaganda, but yes, it's like I understand that. I understand the idea. But yes, there's been a huge reversal in the willingness to take risk in Chinese. I mean, you need a good reason to hold Chinese assets over the longer term if Chinese rates are going to remain below U.S. rates for the foreseeable future. So there needs to either, and normally this has been trading-based rationales and shorter-term kind of flows where you think that there will be policy or liquidity that will support equities or some sort of, the way the PBOC was intervening in the forward market, it became attractive to lend them dollars and buy renminbi-denominated assets on short. Those are very temporary factors that have facilitated these inflows. But you're exactly right. There's been a huge reversal and considerations, keep in mind, over the last 3 years of China becoming uninvestable. The domestic tech stories have changed that a little bit, but there's still very limited sort of foreign participation in FDI in the Chinese economy. Those have been longer-term structural shifts, and that helps to that has sort of accelerated this process of, and the same is true of de-risking of corporate supply chains and manufacturing supply chains away from China. This is an inevitable trend as well.
I was going to ask, one is on a different angle to think about this tension between the US and China. It's on the digital asset world, right? So China, like other countries, are taking the CBDC route, trying to set up a network for RMB, digital RMB, for payment system, has linkages with a number of countries in Asia and Middle East. The US has decided to go the private money route, the stablecoin, and a prohibition on CBDCs. And the expectation is that the US dollar stablecoin will be a way to support dollar dominance. What is your view on terms of, like, from that standpoint, that game of geopolitics is being played?
I don't think this is an area that generates a lot of interest or activity in the Chinese system, to be perfectly honest. I think a lot of what China does is essentially defensive in terms of digital assets. They have the creation of the CBDC was largely a reaction to the announcement of Libra in 2018, and they haven't really expanded this. I mean, there's not really much geopolitical implication in the way in which they set up the structure of their system, which is focused on supplanting domestic retail payment networks and making sure that if there were problems in their if their domestic retail payment networks, there could be alternatives. You have seen mBridge and other networks of digital currency transactions start to expand. The volumes here are very token. Most measures of renminbi internationalization broadly, digital or analog, has sort of gone into reverse. This has never been a high-level commitment for the Chinese government. So I don't view it as, I think often what happens in the Chinese system is they hear that there's something that might generate demand for dollars and a facility to capture capital outflows from the Chinese system, and there's an attempt to respond to it. PBOC's underlying concern is that the outflows from China are inevitable and they have to constantly fight against them because China has the world's largest dollar money supply at $44 trillion, consistently growing at $3.5–4 trillion in new renminbi every year. The inflows are not inevitable, but I do not hear or see the kind of political action taken toward, geopolitical competition in this realm.
Okay, maybe we can close the question on AI in terms of, like, the gap. Is China closing the gap with the US, right? If you look at cities like Shenzhen, Hangzhou, it feels like China is making huge progress. At the time when the ecosystem that actually allowed the US to become the driver of innovation, the universities, the immigration system, capital markets, they are all being challenged in one way or another by the current administration. How do you see that gap between the two playing out from here?
You've asked the question I know the least about, which is like really how to assess actual
That's
progress
the way to close
in artificial intelligence. So I'm certainly not going to. I'm far from a technologist in this regard. We have people who understand this at understand these things at a far more granular level. The only thing I would say is that the competition doesn't seem to be taking place along the same metrics. China seems to be favoring putting models in consumer devices and working more on the downstream implications rather than really competing head to head and generating models or in sort of assembling narrowing the gap in compute in the same way. So I'm not sure it's proper to assess the kind of level of competition in the way you are. I think we'll find out where some of the productivity gains in these technologies will emerge. I don't think that there's a really sustainable dynamic in China where industries will be favored that are fundamentally trying to reduce that be more capital intensive rather than labor intensive. I think there will be pushback against these overall. So there's probably limits in how much support China can provide over time, in addition to a lot of the fiscal constraints. But in AI, as you know, the funding doesn't come necessarily from the state banking system. A lot of it is from the major corporates, so that can be sustained over a longer period of time. I completely agree that there's longer term pressures on a lot of the U.S. advantages that had been, or more accelerated pressures against the U.S. advantages that had in research and development and immigration that had helped in strategic competition that are working in the other direction as well.
I think with that, we're going to wrap it up. That was a real tour de force of both the economics, and it left a number of political questions for China open, and we'll see how this evolves.
Thanks, Craig. Thanks, Fabio. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much.